The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you that we can gather as members of the body of Christ, that we can study your word, speak to us anew in the ancient scripture about the story of David and your people. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're going to begin our second session on the story of David. This week, we're actually going to introduce David into the narrative, but just kind of quickly reviewing what we covered last week. 1 Samuel 1-10. Israel lacked solid leadership, and so they were vulnerable to other nations, particularly the Philistines. And they also had corrupt internal leaders. We heard about Eli's sons and also Samuel's sons. So they're facing a leadership crisis. At the very beginning of 1 Samuel, we were introduced to Hannah. And Hannah is really, in many ways, a parable for Israel, in that God has the power to work incredible reversals in and for the lives of God's downtrodden people. So Hannah is a symbolic figure, very important in that regard. Hannah was barren. She prayed to God for a son, and she gave birth to a son. His name was Samuel, and Samuel is presented as this transition figure. He's the last of the judges of Israel, and he's the first of the prophets in Israel. But even as Samuel is growing older, the elders of Israel demanding a change for leadership. And that change, they wanted royalty. And they wanted royalty so that they would have a king and be like all the other nations, even though God had called them and instituted them to be unique, to be different. They want to blend in. We also discovered, especially in 1 Samuel chapters 5 and 6, that God can work in unseen, powerful ways. So God gives assent to the elders' demand for a king. But through Samuel, the divine warning is also given that monarchy will exist for the sake of monarchy. Monarchy will not exist for the well-being of God's people. And there you have in 1 Samuel 8, in Samuel's warning, the king will take. So while the elders of Israel chose to have a king, God chooses who will be first king. And we heard that that choice is Saul. So we're going to look a little bit more at Saul. Initially, Saul has success as the king. So we go to 1 Samuel 11. Then Nahash, the Ammonite, went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, "Make a treaty with us, and we will serve you." But Nahash the Ammonite said to them, "On this condition I'll make a treaty with you, that I gouge out all your right eyes, and thus bring disgrace on all Israel." So there's two things about gouging out the right eye, and Nahash is not a nice guy. That was a right-handed society. So even if someone had a natural proclivity for left-handed, the parents, where they're growing up, would make sure their kids were right-handed. So you're, it just is. And that's what you get even in the Apostles' Creed. He ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand. So yeah. So to gouge out the right eye would be a mark of disgracing them because the right eye was honorable, but there's also a military reason. So it's a right hand society. So the warriors would have a right hand would be their sword. In their left hand would be the shield. And the warrior holds up his shield here and sees out of his right eye. But if the right eye is gouged out, you got one of two choices. You either put the shield here, but then you can't use your right hand, or you don't use the shield. So there's a military reason for his idea. Now the elders of Jabesh said to him, "Give us 7 days respite, that we may send messengers throughout all the territory of Israel. Then, if there's no one to save us, we'll give ourselves up to you." When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul, they reported the matter in the ears of all the people, and all the people wept aloud. So in the past, the threat to Israel had been from the Philistines, and the Philistines lived on the Mediterranean coast. In fact, one of the Philistine cities was down in Gaza. Okay, so the threat to Israel had always been from the west, but now with the Ammonites, the threat is from the east. The Ammonites, modern day Jordan. In fact, you know what the name of the capital of Jordan is? Amman. Goes back that long to the history. So the elders of Jabesh, which is a Israelite city, the elders bargained for a 7-day truce in hopes that perhaps some people in Israel will come to their rescue. Now, if you're besieging a city, you want them to surrender. Normally, you wouldn't give them a 7-day period, a 7-day truce to find someone to rescue you. But Nahash, the Ammonite king, is so sure that no one's going to come to their rescue, he allows them a 7-day truce. Now, here's where Saul comes in. Now, behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen. And Saul said, "What's wrong with the people that they're weeping?" So they told him the news of the men of Jabesh. And the Spirit of God rushed upon Saul when he heard these words. His anger was greatly kindled. He took a yoke of oxen, he hacked them to pieces, and sent them throughout the whole territory of Israel by the hand of the messengers, saying, "Whoever does not come after Saul and Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen." So hacking up the oxen, sending parts throughout Israel, it's basically saying, this is going to be you if you don't show up, okay? And the next day, Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch and struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. When Saul hears what's going on, God's Spirit comes upon him. Now he becomes very bold. He's enraged at the situation. He resolves to act against the oppression. So Saul organizes and directs the attack against the Ammonites. The result is a total victorious rout of the Ammonites. Saul has done what the people wanted. They wanted a king to be like the other nations. They wanted a king to fight their battles. Saul delivers. So when the people said to Samuel, "Who is it that said, 'Shall Saul reign over us?'" When Saul had his coronation, some of the people didn't want Saul. And so now the people are saying, "Bring the men that we may put them to death." But Saul said, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today Yahweh has worked salvation in Israel." Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal, and there renew the kingdom." So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before Yahweh in Gilgal. There they sacrificed peace offerings before Yahweh. And there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So Saul starts out really, really well. The people respond to Saul's victory with a bloodthirsty desire to kill those who had initially resisted Saul's kingship. But Saul responds by declaring none of those opposing him shall be put to death, because it's Yahweh who's worked deliverance this day. So Saul is rightly giving the credit for victory to Yahweh. So because of his leadership in battle, his refusal to take vengeance, and the popular support for his kingship, Saul now appears to be the perfect king for Israel. Or is he? Very quickly, we hear about the rejection of Saul. Now, in 1 Samuel, there are two different stories about Saul really screwing up and therefore being rejected by Yahweh. We're going to look in detail at one of them. The one in 1 Kings chapter 13. And the Philistines mustered to fight with Israel. 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen and troops, like the sand on the seashore in multitudes. They came up and encamped in Michmash to the east of Beth-aven. When the men of Israel saw that, they were in trouble, for the people were hard pressed. The people hid themselves in caves, in holes, in rocks, in tombs, in cisterns. And some Hebrews crossed the fords of the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. In other words, Philistines are coming from the west, and the Israelites flee to the east. Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. So the Philistines have both superior numbers and technology. They have iron weapons, and we didn't read the passage, but the Philistines kept a monopoly on iron. They would not let their blacksmiths go to the Israelites. So the Israelites have bronze weaponry. The Philistines also have chariots. The Israelites don't. And a big reason the Israelites don't is the Philistines are down on the plain. It's ideal for chariots. The Israelites are up in the hill country. And I mean, it is hilly. The area that in the New Testament, it's this area of Samaria. Chariots aren't much good if you don't have good roads or a level playing field. So honestly, note there's no mention either of Yahweh's spirit being upon Saul, or no mention of Saul inspiring the people to victory. Even the Israelites who didn't desert Saul, even the Israelites who stayed with Saul, were nevertheless trembling. Saul waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. But Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering to me and the peace offering." And he offered the burnt offering. Soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and bless him. Samuel said, "What have you done?" Saul said, "Well, when I saw the people were scattering from me, and that you didn't come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I've not sought the favor of Yahweh. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." The exchange between Samuel and Saul is quite lopsided. In the Hebrew, Samuel just says 2 words. Our English translations have him saying 4 words. What have you done? In Hebrew, it's even shorter than that. Saul responds with a 26-word explanation of his actions. Saul knew 3 important things. One was a military detail, one was a chronological detail, one was a theological detail. First, a battle with vastly superior Philistine force is imminent, and the force he has left are about to take off in fear. So Saul knows he better act immediately or else. Second thing Saul knows, Samuel didn't show up in the 7-day period. So he realized Samuel's not here. Samuel is also a priest. Saul is not. Third thing that Saul knows, because this is a holy war, it's necessary to offer sacrifices to one's deity to get them to fight on your side. So that's what he means when he said, I have not yet sought the favor of Yahweh. You got to do some offerings and Yahweh will be happy and Yahweh will fight with you. So armed with all of that knowledge, he's about to face a superior force and his people are fleeing. Samuel didn't show up. Sacrifices weren't made. Saul tells Samuel he forced himself to officiate at the necessary sacrificial burnt offering. So Saul thinks the theological problem is solved. He did the offering. The theological problem is really only just beginning. Samuel to Saul, foolishness. You have not kept the command of Yahweh your God, with which he commanded you. For then Yahweh would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. Yahweh has sought out a man after his own heart, and Yahweh has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what he commanded you. And Samuel rose and went up from Gilgal. So Samuel responds to Saul. His message is twofold. It's a prophetic accusation, and it's a prophetic pronouncement of judgment. The accusation. Saul acted out of pure foolishness. He broke Yahweh's commandment, which Yahweh commanded him. Now, what's interesting, though, in the narrative in 1 Samuel, there was no mention of a commandment from Yahweh that Saul wasn't supposed to officiate as a priest. So Yahweh would have established Saul's reign over Israel in perpetuity. That now won't happen because Saul didn't keep Yahweh's commandment. Instead, Saul's kingship will be taken from him and given to one Yahweh's already chosen. And notice, we haven't been told who Yahweh has chosen, but that's how sovereign God is. So with the rejection of Saul, in a way, neither the readers nor Saul are prepared for such a harsh, absolute verdict. Samuel had not announced a divine dynastic promise to either the people or Saul before this. There was no talk about who's going to succeed Saul as king when Saul's no longer alive. Samuel was quiet about it. And because Saul had no clue about the ground rules, he really never had a chance to succeed. He never had a chance to receive Yahweh's what would have been promise of a dynasty. Yet, with Samuel's verdict, what might have been for Saul will now never be. I mean, this is really the height of tragedy. To me, Saul is the King Lear of the Old Testament. He never really had a chance. He had initial success, then things desperate. So we ask, who is really at fault here? The narrative really never quite says. Is it Samuel's fault for not showing up in time? Is it Samuel's fault for not telling Saul the rules ahead of time? Is it Saul's fault because even though he's king, he had no right to perform a priestly ritual? Or is it even God's fault for choosing Saul in the first place? See, that's why it's the height of tragedy. Yahweh has already picked out the person who would be king in place of Saul immediately after Saul has presented a burnt offering to Yahweh. So Yahweh has already commanded an unknown person to rule over Yahweh's people because Saul didn't keep what Yahweh commanded, even though Saul didn't know it. He didn't know what he wasn't supposed to do. Samuel didn't tell him. So the pattern announced back in Hannah's song, chapter 2, verse 7, motion. Hannah sung about how God or Yahweh exalts, and now Yahweh brings low. So it's their reversal. So if Yahweh has chosen King Saul, who will Yahweh now choose to be the king after Yahweh's own heart? So Saul's rejected, but there's a vacuum. And so in chapter 14 and chapter 15, we're not told who has God already chosen ahead of time to be king because God has rejected Saul. So we move to 1 Samuel chapter 16. Yahweh said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, rejected from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I'll send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he'll kill me." And Yahweh said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to Yahweh. And invite Jesse to the sacrifice. I'll show you what you should do. And you shall anoint for me him whom I declare to you." Samuel did what Yahweh commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him, trembling, and said, "Do you come peacefully?" And he said, "Peaceably. I have come to sacrifice to Yahweh. Purify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he purified Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. It's not clear why Samuel is grieving. But what is clear is Yahweh's twofold decision about kingship. First, Yahweh, Samuel. Second, Yahweh's already provided for himself a king from among Jesse's sons. And note how the narrative has Yahweh say it. "I've provided a king for myself," not a king just for Israel, but the right king for Yahweh. Now, both Samuel and the elders of Bethlehem are quite aware to anoint a new king when there's still a king on the throne is an act of treason. So that's why Samuel's going, "Oh, wait, hey, if Saul hears this." So Yahweh gives Samuel a cover plan, sacrifice to Yahweh, which Samuel carries out precisely. So this is complete clandestine operation. When they came, that's Samuel, looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely Yahweh's anointed is before him." But Yahweh said to Samuel, "Don't look on his appearance or the height of his stature, because I've rejected him. For Yahweh sees not as a human sees. A human looks on the outward appearance, but Yahweh looks on the heart. And then Jesse called Abinadab. So Jesse's first son was Eliab. His second son is Abinadab, and made him pass before Saul. And he said, neither has Yahweh chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah, third son, be passed by. And he said, neither has Yahweh chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, Yahweh hasn't chosen these. So there's certain things that are important that we note here. First, neither Jesse nor his sons know the true purpose of Samuel's mission. They're thinking Samuel's here to sacrifice to Yahweh, and we got invited to the sacrifice. And so even as all 7 sons appear before Samuel, they don't know that Samuel's about to choose one of them as king. All Samuel tells Jesse is Yahweh has not chosen any of his 7 sons. He hasn't told him what Yahweh would have chosen them for. He's just told him, Yahweh hasn't chosen any of those 7. Second thing to note, Yahweh doesn't operate either by the rule of primogeniture, a standard, even sacred rule in ancient societies, nor by outward appearance. Primogeniture, which son gets the inheritance? It's the oldest. That's one of the oldest rules of society. God doesn't operate by primogeniture. In fact, if you go back to the book of Genesis, that's regularly the case. It's the case that God doesn't choose the first son. Isaac wasn't the oldest son. Jacob wasn't the oldest son. Joseph wasn't the oldest son. In a sense, Yahweh can cheat. The other thing, Yahweh doesn't go by outward appearances. Okay? Now there's a third thing, and there's the problem. Samuel has a couple of problems. Samuel tries to apply human standards to Yahweh's choosing. And so Samuel has forgotten about Yahweh's quest for a king after Yahweh's own heart. That's what Samuel told Saul back in chapter 13, verse 14. Now he's forgetting that. He's looking at the outward. Samuel's other problem is that while Yahweh told him that Yahweh has provided for himself a king among Jesse's sons, Yahweh hasn't chosen any of the 7 sons who've passed before him. So Samuel is batting 0 for 7. What's he supposed to do? Then Samuel said to Jesse, are all your sons here? And Jesse said, well, there remains yet the youngest. But look, and Samuel said to Jesse, send and get him for me. Comes here. And Jesse sent. Notice the narrative doesn't tell us his name at first. And Yahweh said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of Yahweh gripped, ta-da, David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Notice, it took 16 chapters and 13 verses before David is introduced. Even though he's a good-looking kid, which is irrelevant to Yahweh, David has no outward credentials to be king. He's the youngest out of 8 sons. He's just a shepherd boy. He wasn't even invited to the sacrifice and the banquet that was going to follow. He comes from an insignificant village of Bethlehem. I mean, that's like saying Odessa. Aside from the interstate exit and the Sap brothers, uh, his family has no pedigree. When we were first introduced to Saul back in chapter 9, we were told Saul's father was wealthy, which meant if you got wealth, you've got some power. And get this one, David's grandmother was a Moabite immigrant. Okay, the Moabites, that's southern Jordan. That's Petra. It was a city of the Moabites. The Israelites could not stand the Moabites. And his grandma, immigrant from Moab. That's the whole story of Ruth. David's only real credential is that Yahweh has chosen him to be king because Yahweh has perceived that his heart is after Yahweh's own heart. And so the spirit of Yahweh, and I love the Hebrew says, grips him. And unlike the case with Saul, Yahweh's spirit will never depart from David. Okay, Yahweh's spirit did depart from Saul. So the divine reversals of which Hannah sang are now being directly applied to the divine choice of Israel's next king. And then we have Saul, the king, meeting David, the one who's now chosen to be king. In fact, there are two biblical traditions about how David, the future chosen king, meets Saul, the current rejected king. One of those is in 1 Samuel 16:14-23. And I'll just give you the highlights quickly. An evil spirit from Yahweh comes upon Samuel. It torments him so that Samuel's servants, or Saul's servants, propose music therapy to soothe Saul. One of Saul's younger servants knows about a son of Jesse who's a skilled musician, and Yahweh is with him. And that's a theological point that's going to be repeated again and again and again. You see some of those references. Yahweh is with David. So Saul invites David into the royal court, loves David greatly, and whenever the evil spirit comes upon Saul, David plays his lyre, and the evil spirit departs from Saul. So one of the traditions, how did David and Saul meet? How did David get in Saul's court? He was a skilled musician. He's going to provide music therapy for Saul. The other story, however, is the one we want to look at in some detail. 1 Samuel 17. Israel and the Philistines were aligned for battle. Okay, so 17, 1-2. The Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah. Saul and the Israelites gathered and camped in the valley of Elah and formed ranks against the Philistines. So you had the Philistines are over here, the Israelites are here, and in between is this valley, very flat. Even today, the highway runs through it, and farmland on either side. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was over 8 feet tall. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you're slaves of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves. Let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your slaves. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our slaves and serve us." And the Philistines said, "Today I insult the ranks of Israel. Give me a man, let us do battle together." And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, there's a couple in which ancient text you read. Old Testament has Goliath about 6'9", which might be more accurate than the Hebrew that has 8 feet. And his weaponry is weighing over 5 pounds, so gargantuan. So he embodies the menacing threat that the Philistines posed to the Israelites. So his size, his proposal for one-on-one combat, his bombast send waves of utter fear through Saul the king and through the Israelites. So remember that Yahweh told Samuel about not looking at outward appearances. So they see this giant, and all the Israelites and Saul, that's all they see, the outward appearance. Now, David is the youngest of an Ephraimite of Bethlehem in Judah, Jesse, who had 8 sons. David rose early in the morning. Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth into the battle line. So Jesse sent David to deliver who are in the army. As he talked with his brothers, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled for him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this guy who's come up? Surely he's come up to defy Israel." David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the insult from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should insult the armies of the living God?" So, as imposing as Goliath is, David's initially presented as totally unimposing. As the youngest of 8, he's the one who keeps the father's sheep. He shows up not to fight, but to feed his brothers that are there to fight. Yet instead of being afraid of this Philistine giant, like everyone else, David rightly perceives that this uncircumcised Philistine is insulting both Israel and the living God. And when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fall because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. You're just a boy. He's been a warrior from his youth." So David, who we now know has been identified as the man after Yahweh's heart, he calls on others not to let their hearts fall because of Goliath. And to embody that call, David volunteers to fight the Philistine. Saul is caught up in Israel's fear. And what's Saul doing? He judges by appearances. He perceives David's just a boy. He's no match for this Philistine who's been a warrior since his youth. David, however, will not be deterred. In fact, David will now bring Yahweh directly into the seemingly impossible situation at hand. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has insulted the armies of the living God. David said, Yahweh, who saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will save me from the hand of the Philistine. So while David considers his exploits against lions and bears as a shepherd to qualify him for taking on the uncircumcised Philistine who's insulting Israel and its living God, David also recognizes that had Yahweh previously saved him from lion or bear, Yahweh will now save him from the hand of the Philistine. So any victory won by David will actually be a victory won by Yahweh. So now he's really demonstrating that he is the person after Yahweh's own heart. So Saul said to David, Go, and may Yahweh be with you. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head. He clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, but he was unused to them. Then David said to Saul, I can't go with these because I'm not used to them. So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. So Saul may bid Yahweh be with David, but Saul is still thinking in terms of the outward, in terms of military. So he tries to equip David with his own armor and sword. Being used to the weaponry of a shepherd, not a warrior, David sticks with the weaponry of a shepherd, not a warrior. The implication is that since Yahweh saved David with stones and a sling before, Yahweh will save him with stones and a sling now. The Philistine came on and drew near to David. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him. He was only a boy, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field. Like Saul, Goliath only sees the outward. He doesn't view David as a worthy opponent, so he despises him, for he's only a boy. Goliath only notices the staff in David's hand, but evidently Goliath does not notice David's sling and the pouch of stones. In fact, Goliath is so sure that this is going to be an easy victory. He taunts David. He claims that he will feed David's flesh to scavenging birds and animals. But David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of Yahweh of the armies, the God of battle lines of Israel, whom you have insulted. This very day, Yahweh will deliver you into my hand, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head, and I'll give your corpse and the corpses of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know Yahweh does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is Yahweh's, and he will give you into our hand. So David's response to Goliath's derision and disdain is with keen theological insight. This is really Yahweh's battle. In other words, Goliath brings a sword and a spear to a God fight. Everything David says and does is built on the theological foundation. This is not only Yahweh's battle, it's to be Yahweh's victory as a witness to Israel and a witness to all the earth. David is indeed demonstrating he's a man after Yahweh's own heart, even though right now he's only a boy. And when the Philistines drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. There was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine. He grabbed his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him. Then he cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. And as soon as Saul saw David go against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this boy?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I don't know." And the king said, "Inquire whose son the boy is." And as soon as David returned from striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him, brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you?" And David answered, "I'm the son of your servant, Jesse the Bethlehemite." So now David is no longer the shepherd boy, the youngest of 8 out in the field. Now he's in the court of Saul. And we'll pick it up in 2 weeks, November 5th. We're going to see David's relationships with Saul, with Saul's son Jonathan, with Saul's daughter Michal. And then we'll also see the fate of Saul being worked out. We know it's not going to be good because Samuel's already pronounced it. Yahweh's already made his decision. But it's going to be a tragic end. So we'll leave it with that. Thanks for coming. Thank you.